Okay, so what stage do we have here? Cap stage. And so this is what? And the lamina, this is the outer enamel epithelium. What's that there? Cervical loop. And there is the inner enamel epithelium. Okay, so you guys still have survived, at least your minds have survived since your midterm in microbiology. Okay, so there's the dental follicle there. And how about this stage? Late Bell stage, because we have both enamel and also dentin. So there are the odontoblasts, and around the outside we have the ameloblasts. There's the outer enamel epithelium. And as you can see, we don't really have much in the way of mineralized tissue until we get right there, and that's when that begins to close down on top of that, forming, that reduced enamel epithelium. So as we come down this way, down towards the cervical loop, and look at that layer of the inner enamel epithelium, you'll see the more earlier stages in the ameloblast life cycle. And that's the permanent tooth bud right there. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so permanent tooth bud, late Bell stage, and we'll keep going here. Okay, so this is looking down towards that cervical loop. Here's the inner enamel epithelium. There's the stratum intermedium, and then the stellate reticulum, and the flattened cells of that outer enamel epithelium. And of course, these two will fuse, forming Hertwig's epithelial root sheath, but without that stratum intermedium intervening. So here's the papilla, and so those would be in what stage of the ameloblast life cycle? It's down towards the cervical loop, so it's morphogenic stage. Okay, and as you look at these in the laboratory, they will vary a little bit. Let's go on to the next slide here. They will vary a little bit. They'll either be nicely cuboidal, could be a little bit flattened, or perhaps just a tiny bit elongated. We won't try to identify these as being in the organizing stage unless we see some predentin or dentin, but no enamel. Okay, so for the lab practical, there's no dentin, no odontoblasts, we'll call it organizing stage, or morphogenic stage. If we have a little bit in the way of dentin, and certainly some odontoblasts, we'll call that organizing stage, just to make things a little bit easier in the laboratory. Okay, well there's a small gap right there, that transient cell-free zone. And as we go on the next slide, we have that cell-free zone again. These are starting to elongate a little bit. We still have a basement membrane, but some of those cells in the dental papilla are beginning to elongate. So we have just kind of a hint right here, the differentiation of the odontoblasts. So here's the ameloblasts, and as we go on to the next slide, you have the diagram from the textbook. There's the stratum intermedium. Here are the ameloblasts, and as we look down here, we've got no differentiation of the odontoblasts, but right there we've got some formation of predentin, so these would be in the organizing stage, and then we come up here and we start to get some enamel, so that would be the synthetic or the formative stage, and there are Tomes processes. And there's dentin and predentin and dentinal tubules, the odontoblastic processes. There's the stratum reticulum and the outer enamel epithelium, and we've got a capillary right there. So recall that the only place that you have a vascular supply in this area would be out here in the ectomesenchyme, beside that outer enamel epithelium, or down in the dental papilla right next to the odontoblasts. So as all of this is being laid down, all these mineralized tissues are being laid down, that's going to have to come closer to the ameloblast, so there's a vascular supply within a reasonable distance for diffusion. Okay, and this is from the textbook as well. So there's the morphogenic stage. Now they're a little bit taller than they are wide, but that's still morphogenic stage. Nothing going on in the dental papilla. And they begin to elongate. They get rough endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparati. Nuclei are starting to shift towards the proximal surface. This becomes the distal surface. And then we start to get some dentin being laid down. And then we get just the hint of enamel. So we go from a rather flat surface to these Tomes processes. And so the enamel is being laid down here. This particular slide, they show this as formation, but we don't have any enamel at this stage. So that's why we're going to skip up to this one. And anytime you see Tomes processes and you see the enamel, then we're in the formative stage. But indeed, this is apposition because we both have dentin and also enamel formation. But we can see the Golgi apparatus and some secretory granules. So as we look for these in the laboratory, we'll go back to the slide down towards the cervical loop. And so we have the morphogenic stage. And then as we go towards the cusp, those cells are going to start to elongate. They're going to start to gear up to form proteins and to secrete it on that distal surface right next to where the dentin is going to be formed. So they're beginning to elongate. And right here, this is switched around. Here are the odontoblasts. Here is the predentin. So we have some cells in the organizing stage. And as that dentin is being laid down, that basal lamina is going to disappear. So we have no basal compartment, we have proximal and distal. Okay, so here are ameloblasts, there are the odontoblasts, getting some predentin. So these are going to start to enter the formative stage. And we'll be able to identify that because we'll see the enamel proteins. And we're beginning to get toward, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so you've got a little bit of enamel forming right there. So here are the cells in the formative stage, and you can see that there is a gap right there. Now that's an artifactual gap. That's due to shrinkage. And as this shrinks, it'll kind of pull on those Tomes processes and they'll look more or less finger-like as you see them with the light microscope. And you'll see something along those lines. So there are Tomes processes right there, right there. There are the ameloblasts. There's a little bit of enamel right there. We've got dentin and predentin. So ameloblasts in the formative stage. And as we go on to the next slide, you can see those again. We have a little bit more enamel, and we have more of the Tomes processes. Now right there you can see one rather plainly, kind of sticking out. And on some slides they will appear much more distinct on other slides. And so for the lab practical, of course we'll show you the best example I can come across in the time allotted. Okay, so here we have ameloblasts. Here's the stratum intermedium and the stellate reticulum and the outer enamel epithelium. So that is the reduced enamel epithelium. You see a capillary out there. And here are the ameloblasts. This is all enamel, and there are Tomes processes. Now you can tell that we still have the formation of the enamel going on, because you can see these little divots right there and there and there. Those perfectly match up with Tomes processes. So before the shrinkage took place, those processes were surrounded by the newly formed enamel proteins. They actually stick into them, but are kind of artifactually pulled away during the processing of the tissue. Okay, and more of them right there. So that's about as good as you're going to see them in the laboratory. So those are all Tomes processes right there, and the ameloblasts. Okay, well, to see the maturation stage, we'll probably have to go to the rat mandible. But this is to give you some idea of what's going on, and we're going to talk about this on Wednesday as well. There are Tomes processes, and you actually have two different types of enamel that are being laid down as these things migrate away. And they go pretty much in the direction of those hydroxyapatite crystals that we see right there. But we'll find some interrod material and also some rod material. And we'll talk about those on Wednesday. Okay, well, this is a transmission electron micrograph. This is the enamel. More correctly, that is the enamel proteins that have been laid down. And here are Tomes processes. And these are linked one to the other by junctional complexes, and we can see the secretory granules right there. So this is a typical merocrine secretion. Here's a secretory granule, goes up to that distal surface, and that content is expelled, just like it might be done in any other secretory cell. Okay, so as we come up to the top of that tooth, you might, on some of them, find a very small area in which we have the maturation stage. And in this case, we don't really have it. Now, previously to the other classes, I have always lied to them and told them this was maturation stage, but you guys are much too bright to be caught up from that. And we have the